I'm from a family of immigrants. You can probably tell from my accent. My grandfather and my grandmother came over on the steamboat from England in 1926. My mother was just 6 years old. She was one of 6 children, and they landed in Halifax, came across on the train, across the frozen wasteland, and landed in Calgary in March in minus 26 degrees centigrade. It's not a good experience when you're from England, the north of England, and you arrive in minus 26 degrees centigrade. It's cold. My mother loved being in Canada. When she was a little girl, she rode her horse to school, uphill and back uphill. She loved where she lived. Her last name was Buckley. And you know what I'm going to say? What do you think happened to that family? What do you think they invented? Not medicine. They had a dairy. And this dairy serviced all of Okotoks, the south of Calgary. When my mother was little and in school, she was a champion hurdler. She could run and jump over those hurdles like nobody could. I think it was from practicing with bales of hay. And eventually, one day, somebody came along who was a scout for the Commonwealth Games. And they watched her and they said, "We need you to come to Victoria to the Commonwealth Games." Well, my mother was thrilled. She was going to get to Victoria. She'd never been out of Calgary, apart from coming from England. But her mother and father said, "Oh, no, 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 no. You work on this farm. You don't go to any Olympic Games or Commonwealth Games." They said, and my mother was heartbroken. Can you imagine? You're invited to the Commonwealth Games and you can't go. And my grandmother said, instead of wishing, put your backbone where your wishbone is. And I thought, what a great phrase that was. Don't put your wishbone where your backbone ought to be. My mother didn't think that was so funny at the time. As she grew up, she, at 19 years of age, met my father. My father was an airman who has come over during the war to Canada on training in Okotoks. She fell in love, and eventually, after the war, he sent for her to come back to England. And that's where I was born. Now, unfortunately, my mum and dad had a very messy divorce when I was 17 years old. And eventually, my mother decided to emigrate to Canada again to be with her family. Second emigration. I was kind of lonely in England. I thought, I'm going to emigrate too, because I'd been on a visit to Canada and I saw all those cowboys and I thought, wow, that's a great place. I really want to go there. And there wasn't much going on in England at the time, so I emigrated too. That was our third emigration to Canada. I said to my mum, I really want to go to university, but I didn't have the skills to go to university, and I had to start as a secretary. And I said, but I really want to go to university. There was no money. And she said, don't put your wishbone where your backbone ought to be. I took that pretty seriously. Eventually, as time went on, I moved to Vancouver, and my mother moved not long after. And then I moved to Kelowna. I wasn't trying to get away from her. It just happened I moved up to Kelowna. Then I got a call, no daughter wants to get. Your mother has had a stroke. She had been all night at home before they found her. And she was taken to hospital in remarkably good condition. I believe it was all those days on the farm jumping over the bales of hay. We decided we would bring her up to Kelowna to stay with us. But then I noticed something. My mother was starting to forget things. And before too long, I realized my mother probably had dementia. What was the first clue that she had dementia? Well, we used to go to the doctors together. We had a double appointment, a double-double. She would go in and see the doctor, and then it would be my turn to see the doctor. And I remember the doctor saying to her, Mrs. Metcalf, would you mind taking a seat outside? And this is what she did. She picked up the chair and took it outside. Now, I thought that was a little strange. The next thing I knew, my mother was telling me, oh, I think this is where your Aunt Ethel lives. Now, my Aunt Ethel lived in Calgary. She didn't live in Kelowna. I knew there was something a little bit odd. But on top of that, my Aunt Ethel had died 10 years earlier, so I knew there was something a little strange going on. As time progressed, my mother fell into Alzheimer's. When a person has Alzheimer's, many people don't want to go and visit them because they're scared. They're scared that they may not be recognized by that person. My brother was scared stiff. He lived in Spain, so he had a pretty good excuse not to come all the way to Canada. But he said, no, not visiting. No, don't want to see her like that. I said, it's not about you. It's about her. She looked after us when we were kids. She changed our diapers. It's time to change hers. I went to see her, and I've got to say, that was some of the most beautiful time I've ever spent with my mother. Now, you tell people when they come to see her, she's not going to recognize you, just be prepared. And she's not going to be the way she was when you last saw her. She has a terrible memory. Well, wouldn't you know, when they come, she remembers everything. She remembers who they are. She remembers everything they've ever done. And you look like you've put your mother into a nursing home for no good reason, and they hate you, right? As she progressed with that illness, there was a part of her that was still there. And it was the part of her when she was a little girl. She remembered everything about when she was a little girl. One time, her brother came to visit her with his wife. Unfortunately, her brother also had Alzheimer's, but they remembered each other. We took them both out to a fish and chip shop, their favorite meal. Now, my mother looked at her brother and said, Steve, do you remember the name of the dog we had on the farm? And he said, yes, I do. The dog's name was Woody. And my mother said, no, it wasn't. His name was Stiffy. And my brother and her brother were saying, no, it was Woody. No, it was Stiffy. And I thought, get me out of here. How can this be happening in a fish and chip shop? They were lovely together, but as time went on, as I said, my mother did progress further and further. Now, my mother was wonderful about remembering birthdays. She always gave me the fantastic birthday card, and I knew this year she wasn't going to remember. And so I thought it was important that I remember for her. What I did was I went out, and this is what you need to do with people with Alzheimer's. I went out and bought myself a card. And I came to see her, and I said, "Mum, it's my birthday." And she said, "Oh, is it? I didn't get you a card." And I said, "Yes, Mum, I got it in the mail." And I opened it. Here it is. Now, I must admit, I did find the best card, I've got to say. To my wonderful daughter. "You are the light of my life." I read this to my mother. She loved it. "You are special, and I will always treasure you. Happy birthday, Denise. Love, Mum." And my mother said, "Oh, I'm so glad I got you the right card." She was a beautiful person. As Alzheimer's progressed, I kept thinking, I'm going to be glad when this is finally over, because my mother never would have wanted to be seen like this. The day I got the call, for a week, the nursing home had been closed. And I got that call. They said, "Denise, we need to tell you about your mother, Joyce." For some reason, I had no idea what they were going to say, and yet I had expected this call for so long. And they said, "Your mother died last night in her wheelchair." I was so shocked. She was 86 years old. You'd think that's a pretty darn good life. I cried like I have never cried before. I couldn't understand it. I should have been happy my mum had moved on. I miss her. I miss her today. There's so many questions I wanted to ask her and didn't have the time. If you celebrated Mother's Day recently, then you'll know our mothers are beautiful. Our mothers deserve a hug whenever we see them. I said to my mother, "I love you." And she said, "Do you?" I said, "Mum, I love you every single day. I will never, ever forget you." So on Mother's Day, my husband takes me out for Mother's Day. Unfortunately, my 9-month-old daughter died. So we remember my daughter and my mother on Mother's Day. And we get a white rose to remember them both. And let's go on that journey. Let's remember, we all die sometime. I mean, it's inevitable. And let's remember the people who've given us joy in our lives and know that every day with them is a special day.